300 years ago, settlers on a freezing, wind-battered peninsula in New England built a house so simple, so brutally efficient, that it survived hurricanes, blizzards, and 250 winters without changing shape. Today, that same design just showed up on the other side of the Bay of Fundy, shrunk down to 400 square feet, and it might be the smartest tiny house you can build in Nova Scotia. It's called the Cape Cod Tiny House. And by the end of this video, I'm going to show you why this centuries-old shape is quietly outperforming every trendy modern tiny home design when it comes to surviving a maritime winter, what it actually costs to build one here in 2026, and the one design detail almost every tiny house builder gets wrong when they try to copy it. Before we get into it, if you're new here, welcome to Affordable Tiny Homes. Every video on this channel is built on real numbers, real builders, and zero sponsorships. So hit subscribe if you want the truth about small living instead of sales pitch. And tap that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep doing research like this. Okay, let's get into it. To understand why a Cape Cod tiny house makes sense in Nova Scotia, you have to understand why it was invented in the first place, because it wasn't invented to look cute. In the 1600s, English colonists landed on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and immediately got hit with a climate that was nothing like home. Brutal winters, howling coastal wind, and heavy snow. They needed a house that could be built fast, built cheap, and survive whether that could kill you if you got the design wrong. So they stripped everything down. 1 or 1.5 stories. A simple rectangle. A steep gabled roof with almost no overhang. Pitched hard enough that snow and ice couldn't sit on it and crush the structure. A massive central chimney so one fire could heat the entire house. Small, evenly spaced windows to hold in heat. Cedar shingle siding that could take a beating from salt air and wind without rotting. Every single decision was about survival, not style. And that's exactly why, 400 years later, this shape still makes sense in a place like Nova Scotia, because the two climates are shockingly similar. Cold, wet winters, heavy snow loads, damp, salty coastal air that destroys cheap materials. Nova Scotia isn't just borrowing a pretty New England look. It's borrowing a survival blueprint that was field-tested for centuries in almost identical conditions. So what actually makes a house a Cape Cod? For things, and every single one earns its place. The steep gable roof. This is the signature move. A Cape Cod roof pitches sharply from a central ridge, which does two jobs at once. First, it sheds snow and rain fast so weight never builds up on the structure. Second, that steep pitch creates a tall, usable attic space instead of wasted dead air, which is exactly what a tiny house needs, because in 400 square feet, you cannot afford to waste a single cubic foot. The dormers. A dormer is a little box that pokes out of the roofline with its own small window. On a full-size Cape Cod, dormers turn a cramped attic into a real second floor. On a tiny house, they do something even more valuable. They let you build a sleeping loft that you can actually stand up in, instead of the classic tiny house problem of a loft where you're crawling around on your knees to get dressed. This one detail solves one of the single biggest complaints tiny house buyers have after living in their build for a few months. The symmetrical, compact footprint. A classic Cape Cod is a tight rectangle with a centered front door and evenly spaced windows on either side. No wasted hallways, no awkward angles. On a tiny house, that symmetry translates directly into lower material costs. Because a simple rectangular frame uses less lumber, fewer cuts, and less waste than any of the geometric or curved tiny house designs you've seen on this channel before. The shingle or clapboard siding. Traditional Cape Cods use cedar shingles or clapboard, both of which were chosen specifically because they hold up against damp, salty coastal weather. That's not a coincidence. That's the same climate stress test Nova Scotia's South Shore and Cape Breton coastlines put a house through every single winter. Let's actually walk through the layout, because the exterior is only half the story. On the ground floor, you're typically looking at an open-concept kitchen and living area running the length of the house, with the kitchen tucked against one gable end where the plumbing stack can run straight up through the wall. A 3/4 or full bathroom usually sits just off the entry, keeping the water lines short and cheap to run. Because the roof carries so much of the design's personality, the ground floor's ceiling can stay a practical 8 feet, giving you a normal, livable feel instead of the claustrophobic vibe some tiny houses get stuck with. Upstairs, under the dormers, is where this design really separates itself. Instead of one shallow crawl loft, a Cape Cod tiny house with 2 dormers can support a genuine bedroom with a real bed frame, a dresser, and headroom to stand up and get dressed without hunching. Some builders are even splitting the upstairs into 2 smaller sleeping areas divided by the central chimney chase or a mechanical stack, which is a smart move if you're building this as a guest cottage, a rental unit, or a home for a small family rather than a solo retreat. The central chimney, or in a modern build, a central mechanical and flue chase in that same spot, keeps your heating source close to the middle of the house instead of pushed against an exterior wall, which means heat has less distance to travel and less opportunity to escape before it reaches every room. That's not nostalgia. That's just good thermal design that happens to be 300 years old. Here's the part most tiny house videos skip completely. A design isn't good just because it's charming. It's good because it's matched to the environment it has to survive in. Nova Scotia winters routinely bring heavy snow, freeze-thaw cycles, and coastal wind gusts that a poorly designed roof simply cannot handle long-term. A steep Cape Cod roofline sheds that snow load instead of fighting it. The compact, low-surface area rectangle means less exterior wall exposed to wind chill, which means your heating system has less work to do. And in a province where small and modular builders are already engineering homes for insulation values well above code minimum to handle temperatures that can drop to negative 20 degrees Celsius, a shape that was already built to fight winter for 300 years is a head start, not a gimmick. This is also why you're starting to see the Cape Cod silhouette pop up on tiny home builder websites serving Nova Scotia, sitting right alongside cottages, mini homes, and modular units, because builders serving this region already default to steep-roofed, weather-tight designs. Cape Cod just happens to be the most historically proven version of that formula. Let's talk real numbers, because that's what this channel is actually about, and every figure here has been checked against current 2026 market data. First, context. As of mid-2026, the benchmark and median home price across Nova Scotia is sitting between $437,000 and $464,000, according to Real Estate Board data for the province. That's the number a Cape Cod tiny house is competing against. On the entry end, basic prefab tiny homes in Nova Scotia and the wider Atlantic Canada region start right around $50,000 for a minimalist shell model, before land and utility hookups are factored in. That's the bare-bones version. No dormers, no upgraded finishes, just a weather-tight box. Move up to a custom, code-compliant, 4-season build, and you're looking at builders like Sycamore Tiny Homes, based right on Nova Scotia's South Shore, with pricing starting around $125,000 plus tax for a fully customizable model. That's the range where a real Cape Cod-style build, with a steep roof and 1 or 2 proper dormers, typically lives. On the higher end, regional and modular builders serving Nova Scotia range from $100,000 up to $200,000 or more for a fully custom, larger layout, and you'll want to budget an additional $10,000 to $20,000 for delivery and site preparation on top of that, depending on how far the unit has to travel and how much work your lot needs before it can be set. So even a fully custom, builder-grade Cape Cod tiny house on the higher end of that range still lands at roughly half the cost of the average Nova Scotia home in 2026, and the most affordable versions can come in at 1/10 of that price. That's not a small saving. That's the difference between carrying a mortgage for 30 years and owning your home outright in 5. Now here's the detail almost nobody talks about. It's the reason I said earlier that most builders trying to copy this style get it wrong. It's the roof overhang, or more specifically, the lack of one. Classic 17th century Cape Cod design used almost no roof overhang at the front of the house. That was intentional. A minimal overhang reduced the surface area that wind could grab onto during an Atlantic gale, which mattered enormously on exposed New England coastline. But when modern builders shrink that same design down into a tiny house without adjusting anything, they accidentally recreate a real problem. because with barely any overhang, rain and snowmelt run straight down the exterior walls instead of being thrown clear of the structure. On a full-size house sitting on a deep foundation, that's a manageable drainage issue. On a tiny house sitting on a shallow foundation or a trailer, that water has almost nowhere to go, and it becomes a serious moisture and rot risk fast, especially in a wet maritime climate like Nova Scotia's. The builders who actually understand this climate extend the overhangs slightly, typically 12 to 18 inches, add proper gutters, and upgrade the foundation drainage, all while keeping the Cape Cod silhouette intact from the street. It's a small, almost invisible adjustment, but it's the difference between a tiny house that looks period correct for 5 years and one that's still standing, dry, and mold-free in 20. So if you're ever evaluating a Cape Cod tiny house build or a builder's Cape Cod floor plan, that's the first thing to ask about. Not the shingles, not the dormers. The overhang and the drainage plan underneath it. One more thing before we wrap up, because this is where a lot of tiny house dreams quietly fall apart. And I'd rather you hear from me now than find out the hard way 6 months into a build. In Nova Scotia, a tiny home isn't its own special category. If it's built on a permanent foundation, it's regulated the same way any small house is under the National Building Code as adopted provincially, and under whichever municipal land use bylaw covers your specific parcel of land, whether that's the Halifax Regional Municipality or a rural county. There's no shortcut permit track just because the house is small. That means before you fall in love with a floor plan, the real first question is what your specific lot is zoned for, and what setback, coverage, and servicing rules apply to it. This actually plays in favor of the Cape Cod tiny house in one important way. Because it's built on a permanent, code-compliant foundation rather than a trailer, it typically qualifies more easily as a legitimate accessory dwelling unit or a full primary residence under municipal bylaws, compared to a tiny house on wheels, which can get stuck in a legal gray area in a lot of Nova Scotia municipalities. If your long-term plan is a permanent home or a rentable secondary suite rather than something you might tow away later, the foundation-built Cape Cod approach tends to be the smoother path through the permitting process. This isn't the right tiny house for everyone. If you want big glass walls, an open industrial loft feel, or a flat modern roofline, a Cape Cod is going to feel small and traditional to you, because it is. The low ceilings on the ground floor and the angled loft walls under the roof pitch are part of the trade-off for that snow-shedding roofline. But if you want a tiny house that looks like it belongs on a Nova Scotia coastline instead of a design blog, that holds its value because the style has never gone out of fashion in 400 years, and that was quite literally engineered for the exact climate you're building in, this is one of the most undercovered options in the entire tiny house world right now. If you made it this far, you already care more about doing this right than 90% of people just browsing tiny house pictures for inspiration. Stick with me for one more section, because the cost breakdown and the permitting reality I just walked you through are exactly the details that separate a build that goes smoothly from one that stalls out halfway through. If this kind of deep dive into the actual engineering behind tiny house design is what you come to this channel for, make sure you're subscribed, because we got Ontario Regency cottages, cordwood construction, and prairie sod houses in this same historic housing series. And there's more coming. Drop a comment and tell me if you'd actually live in a Cape Cod tiny house on the Nova Scotia coastline, or if you're team modern flat roof. I read every single one. Thanks for watching Affordable Tiny Homes, and I'll see you in the next video.